in this lesson, we'll start building out our next user feature, which is going to be a clock. So what I want to do directly below my employee registry heading is display the current time, and I want it to update every second. So in order to accomplish that, I'm going to use the setInterval function from JavaScript because it allows us to perform some kind of logic, a function, at whatever interval we define. So what I'm going to do is define an interval of 1 second, and every 1 second, I'm going to get the current time using JavaScript's date object, and then I'm going to use that to update a piece of state on my component, which is what I'm going to render to the screen. So let me show you how this is going to work. So first up, I want to add a new piece of state. So right here, I'm going to declare my array or more specifically, destructure my array. And I'm going to call my piece of state time, and my setter function I'll call setTime. And this will be the elements that we destructure from the array that we get back from useState. And for my starter time, I'll just provide an arbitrary string of 00:00:00. And that, of course, is going to represent our time with the hours, minutes, and seconds. So let's immediately render this onto the screen. So I'm going to scroll down, and right here below my typography component, I'm going to render another typography component. Make sure it has an opening and closing tag. And right here, I'm going to provide a variant prop set to H2. It's going to be like the second heading. We're going to provide the align prop set to center, just like the typography component above. Then we're going to provide the SX prop to enable us to provide some custom styles. So above, we have a font size of 3 rem. I'll make this one a little bit smaller. So right here, I'll say font size. Let's do something like 1.5 rem. That sounds good, about half the size of the one above. And then right here, I'm simply going to interpolate whatever the value is of the time a piece of state by simply providing it in our curly braces. So right here, you can see we have that value up here. The visual interface looks good to me, but of course, our time is not changing every second. So that is another example of a side effect. It's an operation that we want to run that is kind of separate from the component render, from the actual employee cards and all of that functionality. So whenever you have that side effect, that additional operation, the best place to put it is in an effect. And this operation of time is totally separate from our employee fetch, so it makes sense to use a new useEffect hook call. As I mentioned earlier, you can have multiple hooks being used within the same component. So we can use useState multiple times, and we can similarly use useEffect multiple times as well. So right here, I'm going to say useEffect, and I'm going to provide my arrow function in line here. And I only want this effect to run on the component render, or more specifically after the component render. So I'm going to provide an empty array here. What I'm basically saying is no piece of state should cause this effect to run again. It's only going to run once after the component renders. And we don't need to provide any state here because I'm going to use setInterval to force a state change every second. So here's what that code is going to look like. Within this function that I passed to useEffect, I'm going to call setInterval. And as a reminder, setInterval takes 2 arguments. The first is a function with the logic that we want to run. And the second argument is the number of milliseconds, or the interval at which we want to run this function. So what I'm going to say here is 1000 milliseconds, which means every 1 second, I'm going to run this function right here. So in the body of this function that we pass to setInterval, I'm going to create a new JavaScript date object. So right here, I'll declare a constant called current time. And I'm going to use new followed by date to create a new JavaScript date object. And that date object is going to have a couple methods that I'll need in order to get the current hours, minutes, and seconds. So right here, I'll declare a const called hours. And on my date object represented by current time, I will call the getHours method. After that, I'm going to declare a constant called minutes. And once again, I'll use my current time date object, but this time around, I'll call the getMinutes method. And this is all just a native API of JavaScript's built-in date object. And if you're unfamiliar with the date object, don't worry about it. It's kind of self-explanatory, but it gets you the current date and time if you don't provide any arguments here to the constructor. So every single second when we run this code, this new date object will have the most up-to-date time at that exact second. And I'm going to get the hours, I'm going to get the minutes, and then I'm also going to get the seconds. And that method on the date object is called getSeconds. So then what I want to do is combine the hours, minutes, and seconds into a string format that looks exactly like this. So right here, I'm going to say const time as string, and I'm going to use my ES6 template syntax, template strings. So provide those little squiggly, whatever they're called, tildes. I'm not quite actually sure. I forgot the exact name, but we want that character in order to be able to interpolate our constants above. So we're first going to interpolate the value of hours, then a colon, then interpolate the value of minutes, then another colon, and then interpolate or inject the value of seconds. There we go. So now we have our latest string with the most up-to-date time. And what I want to do is, of course, call my setTime function, which is going to update the time piece of state. And I want to provide the time as string right here. And one additional thing I'm going to do, just because it's going to prove helpful later, is I'm also going to console log time as string as well. So I'm going to put that, save that, and let's take a look on the right-hand side, and there we go. We can see that we are indeed updating the time every second. So what's going on here? Well, React has ran this effect exactly once because it's always going to run our effect function at least once, which is after the component renders. Then we've told it that there's no piece of state that should trigger a rerunning of the effect function. So it's never going to run this logic again. However, because we did a set interval call in the body of this function, the one that ran just once, we established this kind of internal timer within JavaScript land where JavaScript knows every 1 second or at a 1 second interval, it should re-execute this logic. So every 1 second, JavaScript creates a new date object, gets its hours, minutes, and seconds, combines that into a string, and updates our component state. So we are updating our component state at an interval or frequency of 1 second. We are still running one effect, but that one effect is using the built-in set interval function to run an operation every 1 second. Okay, so what we have right here is functioning, and we can see on the right-hand side the time is updating. And if I open my console, we can see that we are also outputting the value of the time. It looks like the seconds isn't perfect because it doesn't have 0 padding, but we don't have to worry about that now. Obviously, if we were building a production app, we would be a little more concerned, but you get the example here. So we can see we are console logging that operation at every interval of 1 second, and we are also updating our time every 1 second. So it looks like this component is fine. However, there is a big problem with this current implementation, and we're going to start discussing it in the very next lesson. So I will see you there.